This next session, I think, is an interesting one because you just sense, with due respect to Leah and Dan, it's not meant as a criticism of them, but you just sense that when you begin to talk about sport and you mention money, there are normally some people in the room who kind of shudder a little bit because it's actually not about money. It's about health and well-being, and it's about kicking a ball outside your house, or playing cricket up against the wall, or whatever else it might be. And yet this is a very, very important part of sport. And before we get into talking to the panel, I just jotted down some figures earlier. So keep these in mind as we talk through this. So when you hear people talking about money and sport, keep these figures in mind. So according to A.T. Kearney, which is a New York-based management consultancy, sport globally is worth $1 trillion. Now, whether or not you agree or disagree with that is a different matter. I think there is an issue from a social scientific perspective, because apparently that's what we're supposed to be talking about. I think there are some measurement issues around how you measure the sport economy. But headline figure is $1 trillion sport is worth globally. In Britain, it's estimated to be worth about 1.5% of GDP. So everything that we produce as a country every year, sport is worth around 1.5% of GDP. If you consider the Premier League, and the Premier League has been very keen to present itself in a positive light, so it actually commissioned this research. So I'll leave you to draw your conclusions on these figures. £2.4 billion in tax revenues every year attributable to the Premier League. Deloitte didn't do this research, did you? Somebody else did this research, okay? So don't pick on Tim afterwards. This is not Deloitte's research. It's another practice's research. But £2.4 billion in tax each year. Premier League sustains 103,000 jobs. And the Premier League contributes every year about £3.4 billion to gross domestic product. Now again, I'll leave you to decide whether or not you believe those figures and whether you think it's measured in the right way, but it's a benchmark of the Premier League and the contribution it makes. In terms of Manchester, there was a piece of research in 2011 looking at the economic contribution of football to Greater Manchester, to the conurbation, and it was estimated that annually football in Manchester generates about £330 million to the local economy. Okay, so keep those figures in mind. So it's not just about money men. There are jobs and livelihoods and export earnings and economic activity, economic benefits associated with not just football, but with cricket, with rugby, with cycling, and lots of other sports in the conurbation. So on that basis, I'm not the main focus of this particular session. It's the four guys. What I'm going to ask them to do is firstly to introduce themselves, and secondly to ask them just to tell you what they do in Manchester and what part their organisation or their business plays to the local economy. So if I could start with you, Eddie.
Hi, my name's Eddie Smith. I'm the Strategic Director for Development at Manchester City Council, and prior to that role, I was the Chief Executive of New East Manchester, the urban regeneration company in the eastern side of the city. I'll talk about what we do as a City Council. We have a very clear leadership role in terms of promoting our city and transforming our city in economic terms. And I have to say that the role of sport is a fairly kind of key part of that bigger picture. And I just wanted to kind of build on the kind of points that were made in the first presentation, which the health and well-being. We're as interested in health and well-being from an economic productivity point of view, getting people back into work. So that kind of first session I heard is very relevant to us, and we're doing a lot of work in that space at the moment. We've talked about the football clubs. We've got the cricket club, which Daniel will talk about, and we've got British Cycling. These are global sports brands. People know them all over the world, and we have to kind of think about, if you're in Portland, they'll probably know about football, but they're more likely to know about British Cycling, and certainly that's been my experience would have been there. And so we see our global sports brands as part of the way of selling the city globally. And dare I say, you go into any city now in the world and say if you're from Manchester, they'll say United or City. And that's the way it is. That's the way Premiership has helped sell out our city over the last 15 or so years. In terms of the projects that I'm working on, I'm a United fan, by the way, and my chief executive is the biggest blue you'll ever find in the city, and he has had me working on the transformation of the Etihad Stadium and the Etihad campus for the last 6-7 years. And part of the work we're looking at is how we can continue the transformation of that place and build it around sport, and sport in its widest sense. Can't say too much about that tonight because there are still things ongoing, but as I say, we recognise the importance of sport as a commercial driver in that place, which is quite unusual.
Thank you. Daniel?
Good evening, everybody. My name is Daniel Gidney. I'm the Chief Executive at Lancashire County Cricket Club that play at Emirates Old Trafford. And they're delighted to be here this evening. In terms of the role that I play, well, Lancashire County Cricket Club has been here for over 150 years. In fact, our Old Trafford is older than United's Old Trafford, a fact that not many people know about. I think sport is incredibly important, and particularly in Manchester, I think the role that we play, Test cricket, international cricket, it's unusual. Football tends to be played at Wembley, rugby tends to get played at Twickenham. Cricket is unusual in the international sport. England play at different grounds around the country, and we're proud to host the most important one in the north, at least if you're a Lancastrian, that is. So Test cricket is incredibly important. It attracts a lot of people from all over the country here, but also international. You said if you go to any city in the world and say, you're from Manchester, and they say United or City, whereas I think if you went to Delhi or Mumbai, they talk about the cricket club. Yeah. So I think cricket has a slightly different feel. We do attract a lot of international visitors, particularly with Test cricket, as I said. The Ashes is a very unusual peak. It's a bit like the British Lions in rugby. It's every 4 years. England have this intense rivalry against Australia, and it's like nothing else in cricket. So every 4 years we have this significant peak where there's a lot of people who don't watch any cricket, but they go once every 4 years to watch a Test match against Australia, which is kind of strange, but that's one of those things. In 2013, Emirates Old Trafford hosted an Ashes Test, and Greater Manchester hotel occupancy was running at 97%, which is pretty good going, I think, for the whole of Greater Manchester. It kind of shows you the power of attracting visitors. In the digital age, we see ourselves as a big content provider. What we're trying to do is to smooth out that content so it's more regular. At the moment, there's big spikes every 4 years. We have an Ashes, and we're pleased to say in 2019, we've attracted, for the first time in 20 years in this country, there will be a Cricket World Cup, and Emirates Old Trafford will be hosting a World Cup semi-final, plus 4 games. Those 5 games is probably worth somewhere in the region of 25 to 30 million in economic impact for the region of Greater Manchester. Once you take into account people flying in, people staying in hotels, people eating in restaurants, people going to bars, that is absolutely fantastic. So not only does it provide that kind of economic impact for the region, but also obviously employment as well.
Thank you. Mark?
Good evening, everybody. Unlike Daniel, I don't represent a sport as such. I suppose we're a service provider to sport. I work at a firm of lawyers called Mills and Reeve that are based in Manchester. I've actually been in Manchester since the sort of mid-80s, and our firm, albeit through its sort of previous its incarnation of George Davis, has been one of the sort of true sports niche practices over the years. Now there's hundreds of law firms that are trying to move into our space as well, which I think just sort of shows how much the sports industry has grown over the last 2 or 3 decades, certainly since I've been practicing. But I think the other sort of trends I've noticed is that so much of our business is football, because football has become such a dominant sport over the years, and there's so much money gone into football, and so much of our work now is actually international work. I probably spend half my time in Manchester and half of it abroad. And yes, it is the same question, are you City or United? Unfortunately, I hate both teams because I'm a bitter Leeds fan. So I'm not sure I'm going to get out alive now. But it is amazing just to see how much international sports work there is these days for lawyers and indeed accountants. I sit as a judge, actually. I work at the Court of Arbitration for Sport in Switzerland, and I've been at Commonwealth Games since Manchester, and it's been amazing to actually go to places like Delhi and to go to even Glasgow, and then I was at the Olympic Games this year, to go to places like Rio, and to actually see how sport has just changed those cities and changed the economies there. I'm sure that's something Eddie will talk to us a little bit more about, to see just what sport has done to the local economy here. But you know, where there's money, there's lawyers, as they always say. There's usually an argument first as well. I mean, just to sort of go back, I've been working at the Court of Arbitration since 2002. In those days, there was probably about 40 or 50 cases. We go through that course every year. We're probably looking at about 600 cases a year going through the Court of Arbitration. So international disputes, people, sports businesses arguing, always about money, sometimes about drugs, but that's usually with the Russians. So it's been an interesting 3 decades that I've sort of worked in sport, but sometimes it's just the change from what it all started with to, which was very much more sort of community based, to seeing what it is now. Sport at the professional level is a huge business and very litigious.
So could you give us a flavour of some of the kind of general areas of law in which you're required to work? Because as you say, there's not just your practice, there are other practices in the in Greater Manchester. So what kind of things are you working on?
It's usually commercial contractual work. It can be putting together sponsorship deals, it can be unravelling those sort of deals. It can be a lot of employer and employee related disputes. I'd say particularly at the Court of Arbitration, we see an awful lot of cases where it's football players against football clubs, sometimes more than one club. I think we're seeing a lot more sort of governance issues coming out, certainly of late, the sort of FIFA challenges and IAAF and various scandals. I mean, being in Rio, it was all about Russian doping. I mean, that was literally the first 2 weeks there. We did nothing but sort out the mess that had been created by basically state-sponsored doping that the Russians had, and the IOC's reaction to actually work on the basis that every single Russian athlete was guilty, unless they could come to their own sports and try and convince them that they were clean, and then we would deal with the appeals of those cases.
Okay, thank you. Tim.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tim Bridge, and I work here in Manchester for the Deloitte Sports Business Group. I'm sure many of you know of Deloitte. It's the global accountancy firm, but what you might not realise is that we have a team of 16 sports specialists working here in Manchester. We are supposed to lead all of Deloitte's work globally in sport, and we probably do about 95% of it. We are probably best known for our 2 publications, and that's the Deloitte Football Money League, which comes out in January and ranks the clubs, or the football clubs, by how much revenue they generate, and our annual review of football finance, which is a bit more of a detailed look at the finances behind particularly English football, but the rest of Europe as well. Like I've said, we work here in Manchester, but we are a global team, so currently we've got team members over in the US, in China, in the Middle East, and in 2 European countries. So it's particularly far-reaching, and I'm often asked why is the Sports Business Group based in Manchester? And firstly, it's because nowadays you can get anywhere in the world very quickly from Manchester, but it's also because this city is really the home of British sport. It's the way that we see it. We're fortunate enough to work with the 2 major Premier League clubs that are in the city. their brand, everything that's associated with them is far bigger than anything we can probably imagine, really. And as Daniel said, I was lucky enough to be in India about 2 or 3 years ago, and people there immediately associate Manchester with cricket. So it's a great city, really, for sport in general. From a personal perspective, my specialisms have grown over the last few years, and I particularly work in football, and I work in helping football federations to understand how they should be best structured and how they should best develop. And that's got a real focus nowadays on community. The community impact of sport is probably greater than it ever is, or greater than it ever has been. But clubs in particular and sports federations are probably particularly poor at shouting about what they do in their community. And it really riles me when I'll hear in the media, for example, people criticise sports clubs and criticise the players and their actions. Yet, if you actually look under the surface and what these clubs and federations are actually doing in their community, you know, they prop up many of the local communities, really. And without sport, it would be particularly interesting to see where our societies would be, and that's none more evident than here in Manchester. If you went out into the community tonight, you'd see all of the local football clubs running sessions, be it for volunteers, be it for people to play sport, but also for people with mental health issues, people with disabilities, to help them integrate better into society. And it's really that side of sport that I think sometimes goes unnoticed, and particularly in Manchester is very strong.
Okay, thank you. Now, Eddie, Daniel mentioned or gave some figures around hotel occupancy rates and obviously around test matches. Do you have anything specific around numbers for Manchester, or perhaps just something generally about the economic and commercial impact of sport?
I think if you just look at it from a visitor perspective in terms of overnight visits, I mean, Manchester is very, very unique in that we're able to draw on a range of visitor groups. We've got a business conferencing market which is very strong. We've got a football market which is very strong. We've got a concert market which is very strong. You push all of those together into one city and you get hotel occupancy rates which are averaging around about 80% at the moment. And as Daniel's indicated, they clearly spike on certain nights. You know, you try getting a hotel room in Manchester when either United or City are playing at home, and you know, the prices are spiking high. You know, I mean, travel lodges will be at £150 a night, where if you're in a non-football night, you can get it for about £28, £32 in certain parts of Manchester. So, and we're adding to that bed stock every year. I mean, we're putting 1,000 beds in each year at the moment, and we're not seeing those occupancy rates dropping. So, it's part of the sporting element is one important strand, and we're trying to create that as a kind of 365 day a year kind of occupancy profile for business, sport and concerts. And as I say, it kind of works very well in terms of the way when those events happen now in the city.
Okay. And Daniel, apart from hotel occupancy, can you give us some of the numbers around cricket, and you know, in terms of how many people typically are there with you on a match day, and perhaps some of your other programs and activities?
Yeah, I think it's obviously our peak is probably, I think the Ashes in 2013 we had 118,000 people across 5 days, which for us was exceptional. I think at our maximum capacity we're at 25,000, which is the second highest in the UK after Lords, and the World Cup will be, you know, I think I talked about the numbers earlier, probably been around probably 25 million to the region, which you take into account hotel, restaurant, bars, travel, everything that goes alongside it. But for test matches, it's generally around 20 to 25,000 people per day for 4 or 5 days. But separate to that, and one of the, you know, when I first came into the role and working in Manchester 4 years ago, you know, we were still very reliant on 6 days of international cricket, and I think that's something that we've worked really hard to create a much more anti-cyclical business, and we've got a burgeoning conference and events business, which, and perhaps this is another seminar another day for the story behind the Emirates Old Trafford naming rights, but one of the main reasons wasn't just putting a sign above the door, which sadly it looks like from some of the football presentations earlier, people are taking a cheque to put a sign above the door and you have to activate. But crucially, if we were going to be taken seriously as a national and an international conferencing venue, LCC events didn't really cut it. And so Emirates Old Trafford became our venue brand. And actually using naming rights to develop a venue brand was a very important part of our strategy. And it's bearing fruit. You know, we have the point which can take 1,000 people column free with no columns and natural light. There's probably only 2 or 3 places like that in the UK that aren't an exhibition centre. And the point has been a real part of our economic engine, if you like, just for growing our non-sport business. But the key element, you can only do so much in terms of attracting large-scale residential conferences to a city if you don't have hotel bedrooms on site. And we had a 67-bed lodge that was basic. We knocked it down, and echoing what Eddie said, we're currently building a 150-bed 4-star Hilton hotel on site. And that, when you link that to a bespoke 1,200 delegate conference space, becomes a real USP in terms of further attracting those big nights. And to put it in perspective, a really high quality 3-day residential conference for 800-900 people, 1,000 people, with a large gala dinner attached and bed nights, you're talking 200 to 250,000 pounds for 3 days' work. And you know, just to put that into perspective, that's significant. But the great thing is all of the hotels around benefit as well. You've just got to make sure you schedule those events on a non-Man City or Man United home game.
And I think some of the points that you made there were really, really good. And again, I'd invite people to think about those, because even the people taking the tram or the bus out towards the stadium are contributing to the local economy. And obviously some of those people will live in the conurbation, but a lot of those people will come from outside the conurbation. And so, as I say, when you start to think about money and sport, it is much more than, you know, a name on a sign or a naming rights deal. There is real depth and breadth to a lot of this activity that's taking place. I really want to ask you two guys on the end, and you're probably not going to know the answer to this. Have you any sense at all of what the service economy is worth to Manchester, you know, in terms of legal services and in terms of financial and accountancy services? Or because we seem to have this clustering effect taking place in Manchester now. Do you have figures, or can you make a more general statement about it? That was a trick question, by the way.
Too much.
Yeah, too much. Yeah, there you go. No, I mean, I think what you can say is, you know, looking at the sort of current legal market, you would say that Manchester is definitely the second city. When I was a sort of a young lawyer growing up, it was probably Leeds. At some stage, Birmingham may have said that they had a bigger, more developed market, but I think without a doubt, it's Manchester now is behind London. But London is its own sort of world economy, really. It's like a separate country. So for sure, the legal market in Manchester is.
So in terms of sport and law, who are your rivals?
Sport and law, I mean, say when we were George Davis, we were sort of doing sports law 50, 60 years ago, because we actually still do act for the PFA, the Footballers Union, and that's been an incredibly long established business, if you like, or union that's been based here in Manchester. I think over time we've seen people like Grabner's, who are one of the large firms as well. But they've split in two, so they've now created two sort of sports niches, if you like, from there. There's a number of the sort of the out-of-town firms and London firms are coming in and trying to develop sports as a sector as well. I would say there's probably 10 firms now in Manchester that could credibly say that they do sports work to a regional level.
All employing people and all drawing in income from elsewhere in the country and elsewhere in the world.
Too much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I guess with Deloitte, because KPMG are building a new, constructing it, and they too have a football practice, and without wanting to go into too much detail about that.
No, it's slightly different kind of on the advisory side. So
right.
Of course the other big four firms and the other accountancy and advisory firms work in sports. That's naturally what happens. KPMG have recently started their kind of sports practice out of Budapest, and you know, we are seeing them as they are competition to us, of course. But there is no other big four advisory firm working specifically in sport with a dedicated sports business group in the UK other than Deloitte, and we are in turn then based in Manchester. So I think we've kind of been pioneers really into the sports market, and as such kind of hold the market dominance really. I think where Manchester really does benefit as well is there are pioneers really. You look at what Daniel's done over at the Emirates Old Trafford. We're not seeing that across other sports. We're not seeing people realise that a sports stadium is realistically only used maximum 25 days a year, and there's another 340 days a year where you can use that stadium and you can try and make money from it. And I think that's kind of where Manchester has led from the front. Of course, the brand of Manchester United speaks for itself. Their growth and success on the pitch at the time when the Premier League went global was critical. The new owners of City have come in with a very clear remit, sat alongside the council and developed something that's incredible for East Manchester. And then the other sports in the area have tried to follow suit and have tried to maximise what they have available. That isn't the case in other cities. You know, other sporting arenas and other sporting entities are struggling in comparison, and really that's where Manchester leads from the front.
You know, again, just as a quick interjection, I know some of you are particularly involved as Pro Manchester. I've worked all over the country, and I don't think I've come across an organisation like Pro Manchester, particularly its sport industry group. So for those of you who don't know Pro Manchester, Google it. That's your homework for tonight. But I think the fact that they have a dedicated sport industry group is testament to the power and the significance of sport in Manchester. So it's something that I would recommend that you look at. Just to give the guys a break, and also so I don't talk too much, have we any particular questions at this point? Is there anything that people want to raise?
Everyone looks at a lawyer, don't they? I think we've spent a fair bit of time with some of our clients looking at Brexit and to try and understand what it could mean, particularly with the sort of footballing clients. I think on the one hand, the initial shockwave of Brexit has meant a big change in the exchange rates. So it should mean that we're having to pay more, or the British clubs are having to pay more to bring the players into this country. But it's coincided with a time when the new Premier League deal is just risen by 70% or something. It's a crazy amount. So it's certainly not had any effect on the spending power of Premier League clubs to bring the best players in. But it could get to a point where freedom of movement is gone as far as European talent's concerned. So then they have to be treated in the same way as a player coming from South America or from America. But still suspect there might be some pressure to be brought by those in the sort of dominant positions in the Premier League, dealing with the government to try and make sure that Brexit doesn't affect football in particular. The other aspect is, again, the sort of freedom of movement if you're between 16 and 18 in football. So if you can go from one European country to another. If you're from America, for example, you've got to be 18 before you can come over. So there's a special exemption for, if you like, between European states. But we're not leaving Europe. We might be leaving the Union. So I'm not convinced that rule is actually going to have any effect, because you can still go from France to Switzerland. You can still go from England to Norway between 16 and 18. So I think there's a lot of sort of initial fear factor that some of the young talent that teams like Arsenal tend to bring in could be stopped immediately once we do Brexit. But my gut feel is that it's probably not going to be as impactful as we think, and that we can probably find a way around these things by negotiation.
I agree with that. I think we have to find a way of dealing with it. I think, you might say, why is somebody who works in a cricket environment talking about Brexit? We don't really have a European market per se. But coming back to the non-sport part of our business, the 320 days a year conference and events business, and we see a big opportunity in terms of exporting our conference facilities into Europe in terms of the weaker pound. So actually we see that as a real opportunity to make our location more attractive to international visitors.
You'll also find that sport is particularly resilient to kind of wider economic changes. So despite the fact that global recession hit in 2008, people still, snapped up the Ashes tickets just a few years later, or really wanted to keep going to watch Manchester United, Manchester City. And so the feeling really is that sport and football will find a way through that suits sport. And I tend to agree with Mark there.
Anything from a local government perspective that's preoccupying you around this? Or is it too much? Did you just want to say too much?
Our standard line is we have to wait and see what this all means first, and I know that's I'm really passing this one, but there's just so much speculation about what actually Brexit will be. None of us in this room knows what it's going to be. So until we see what it is, and hence the discussions last week in Parliament and whatever, I just think we just have to kind of suck it and see it for a while. All of the issues which we're dealing with in terms of devaluation of the pound and whatever, we don't know if they're short-term, medium-term, or long-term impacts or anything, but we have to see the deal, and we have to see the government strategy, which that's going to tell us what we're going to look at for the next several generations, probably. Okay.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, I'm aware of the time, so I'll move to really my final question, which is really around when you're looking ahead, what do you think are the big issues, I guess, facing Manchester, facing Britain when it comes to sport, but even internationally too? And I'm thinking particularly commercially and economically. I guess Brexit is one of these things. But for you, Eddie, in your role, what's occupying you as you look ahead?
Well, I couldn't really tell you that. What do I think going forward? Well, one, around the Etihad Stadium, we will probably within the next 6 months be making some very significant announcements about how we're going to move the platform that we put in place together with Abu Dhabi United Group. We're in a joint venture with Abu Dhabi to develop the land around the stadium. We've got in another joint venture with them to develop all the residential between the stadium and between Piccadilly. So there's some very, very exciting things coming up in the lift. In Greater Manchester, I'm not going to say too much about this, but there are some potentially very exciting world events coming to Greater Manchester, not in this decade, but in the next decade. We've got small events coming. But I think, for instance, the bid that Peel are leading to try and bring the Ryder Cup to Greater Manchester in 2026. I've learned more about golf in the last 6 months than I've ever knew. I mean, I didn't know that the Ryder Cup was the third most watched sport event in the world after the Olympics and the World Cup. And it's just a staggering kind of statistic, that, and Peel's ambitions to develop that golf course and associated development will be a game changer for Greater Manchester in the next 10 or 15 years, if it's all pulled off. And there are a few other things which we can't talk about, but I think it's very, very exciting what's looking forward. As a city council, as I think others have just kind of hinted at, we've really significantly invested hard into sport, into all aspects of sport from community upwards, and that really is reaping the rewards that we have anticipated. We've got participation rates now at their highest amongst core cities, and they're continuing to increase. We've got an investment programme that, despite all of the madness of local government finance at the moment, we are still investing in new indoor sports and outdoor sports infrastructure at a rate which no other city is doing at the moment. And the only thing that other cities would require is a major event like a Commonwealth Games or whatever. and we're still doing it, and that's testament to the leadership of the City Council.
I have to say at this stage that one of the reasons I asked Eddie is that a guy called Phil Smith, who is Chief Executive of Sport England, I think that's his correct job title, Chief Executive of Sport England? I think so. Yeah. So I said, who could I get from Manchester to speak at this event? And he recommended that I speak to Eddie. And Phil said that he believes that Manchester takes sport more seriously than any other local government in the country, and does a far more effective job than any other local government in the country. So for those of you who've perhaps not lived elsewhere, or perhaps you have lived elsewhere and you've been impressed by what Manchester is doing, I think this is obviously a reflection of a big commitment and a concerted effort on the part of local government. So I thought
just compare the deal that West Ham have got for the London Stadium and the deal that we've got at the Etihad Stadium with Man City, and they are apples and pears, and it's the biggest scam ever of what's happened down at West Ham. And I will say that publicly. I just think it's outrageous.
Yeah, well.
We put $5 million a year into community sport out of our rent in the stadium.
Mm-hmm. Daniel?
And we don't pay for the goalposts to be changed.
As you know, my former life, I'm one of the few people in the country who's run a stadium that's rented a football stadium to a football club.
Let's not talk about Coventry City. So that's too complicated.
But I do endorse the fact that Sir Howard Bernstein's plan and legacy around the Commonwealth Games and the whole original vision for the Etihad Stadium is amazing. And if you compare that to the London Stadium, it is apples and pears, it is sublime and ridiculous in terms of the difference. So I completely endorse that. In terms of where I see the kind of real trends and the things that can be really important to both Emirates Old Trafford, Lancashire Cricket Club and for the greater region in terms of sport over the next, say, 10 years or so, I think there's three things. There's, from a sports business perspective, it's, and I would say this, wouldn't I, but I think it's really important that if sports clubs are constantly seem to be in a state of financial crisis, and actually it's not a dirty word to say that, a sports club should be run properly like a business. It's every other business situation. If you run out of money, you go bust. But it's kind of everybody thinks, oh well, it's okay, it's sports, so it can be run poorly. And I think most salary caps, are above broadcast revenues that come in, and I think, well, there aren't a salary cap, and I think that's something that is really important, that sport just doesn't get ahead of itself in terms of running itself properly as a business, developing 365 days worth of revenues, keeping a handle on how the broadcast revenue and salaries work. I think that's really important. I think secondly, for us, we're now in a digital age. Everybody's consuming everything on their tablets. I've got a 13-year-old daughter who will tell me that why does she need to go to an event when she can just watch it on her phone. That's very challenging for me, somebody who's worked in sport and entertainment for a long time. But it's a positive challenge, because what it says is we have to make the live experience absolutely fantastic, so that digital becomes part of the consumption story. But actually, we have to make sure, if you're working in that live environment, that live experience is the most incredible thing, and it continues to be that most incredible thing, so it becomes a memory. And finally, in terms of the greater region, if we want to continue to bring major events into Greater Manchester, I've talked about the Ashes and the World Cup coming in 2019, we have to continue to invest in infrastructure, and specifically hotels. Hotels is the one thing that regions let themselves down on when they're trying to attract major events, and I think Manchester has led the way in terms of constantly upping their bed stock. And there is transport infrastructure, and yes, people curse about the trams and the challenges that we've had, but ultimately that is the long-term vision, to say that, if you want to attract millions of people to a region to see particular events, you have to back it up with infrastructure, and there's a lot of cities around the world just don't do that.
I'm going to echo what both these guys just said. I think looking forward to sports to continue to develop, I think we need to see better governance at times, and I think we need to see better management. You know, I think I'm much an insolvency practitioner as well as a lawyer, and past sort of ITV digital days, I got involved in maybe 40 or 50 clubs, football clubs that went bust, and it was just shocking to actually sort of see how badly run sports clubs are. And even a decade on, I'm not convinced that all of them have learnt the lessons they should. At times I look at the people who are actually running some of the major sports, and their governance is shocking. And I think for sports to continue to flourish, it's got to still be pure, and it's still got to have a competitive element to it. And sometimes this is what worries me a little bit about things like the Premier League, is it's making so much money that the gap between the others and it is getting so large. There's got to be a better way of sort of sharing revenues. It does come down to sort of salary capping, but also sometimes sort of the sharing of revenues a little better to try and keep sports competitive, interesting, and safe.
Just as a quick post-Brexit question, because obviously it's difficult to salary cap under European Union law, do you think that if we do leave the European Union, we might see some form of salary cap begin to emerge?
I mean, we have an element of salary capping in the Premier League and in the football leagues already. I mean, it's called. Well, that's
a soft cap as opposed to a hard cap, right?
Absolutely. I don't know. I mean, you could have a long conversation about, if you like, sort of open sports that we see in this country and closed sports that we see in America. Closed sports are very much franchise models, and the money is all shared. A certain percentage of it will go to players, a certain percentage of it will go to the owners, of which they only need so much to cover the overhead. So they're all making profits, they're all in a business. They have nice mechanisms of sort of sharing. The best team gets the worst team gets the best young players coming in draft picks. As a business, it works really well. It's really competitive to watch, but it's not really pure when they take your club from Los Angeles and move it to St. Louis or something else like this. So, it's always a balance, I think, of trying to sort of get the sort of community aspects and the business right. But I still think these are the things that need to be done to enable sports to continue to develop.
Good work in Leeds United's favour, though.
Yeah, well, I've heard he's going to
take them down to Slough or Weybridge or somewhere like that. So. Tim?
I think football in particular, but sport is probably in the UK kind of at that next transition phase that you maybe talk about. I think the days of, in particular, Premier League clubs making huge losses, they are now behind us. You've got Premier League clubs turning operating profits, turning profit at a bottom line as well. The cost control measures that Mark touched on have had an impact. All of the increase in revenue now is not simply going into the players' pockets. And let's not kid ourselves, that's not necessarily happened due to purely the good running of the game. It's happened due to the increase in the TV money and the amount that the clubs are generating. And what we're seeing is clubs now cash rich and having to make wiser investment decisions. So you're seeing them investing in things like their community hubs, their training grounds, and their long-term future. And I think that is the stage where we're getting to across football and then across wider sports, hopefully as well. Just taking a point that Daniel made as well around the kind of digital age. I think there's two challenges. I think there's a challenge to sport, which is people now not needing to attend. I was in Spain about a year ago and somebody told me they'd watched a Barcelona game, sat in the stadium using a virtual reality mask, and the virtual reality mask put them in a seat at the stadium, and that to me as a traditional football fan is utterly ridiculous. But at the same time, are we going to see more and more of those trends overtaking the people actually going to the game? And then the people who are going to the game, are they using their phone throughout the match to record, to watch replays, to buy from the shop, whatever it might be? They are, yeah. You go to any sports arena now and you see people on their phone throughout the game. So the challenge to sort of the sports administrators is to really understand how can they make the product integrate really with the new age technology and the new things that we're seeing coming into sport.
Okay, thank you. We're okay. We are over time, but we're not quite as late as the train that I took this morning up from Coventry. So, anybody got any finishing or final questions?
Just one on governance, Mark. You talked about some of the issues that you're still seeing now across sport. Do you see that changing anytime soon? And where do you see the onus coming from? Will it be from sporting bodies and organisations that sit above the clubs, or from the clubs themselves?
So, gut feel and experience is that change is very hard to implement, and the people in power very rarely want to change and embrace it. You sometimes need some catastrophe, like we've seen at FIFA. When it actually, what appeared to be endemic was just sort of taking backhanders and money out of the game, and it took something like the FBI to come along and actually start arresting a few people to actually make a real change there. I think the FA have tried desperately to try and change their governance structure, and it's not easy. Greg Dykes just resigned pretty much on the back of the fact that he couldn't actually drive through the changes that he wanted. We're in a sort of non-interventionist country, so the government don't have a sports act or anything like this, but they do have commissions, and they do look at sports, and they do look at governance, and if they're not happy with what they're seeing, then they threaten to legislate. So this may be where change comes in the future, as a sort of threat to get your house in order, and if you don't, we're going to do it for you from the government. But I say, if you leave it to sports governing bodies, they don't tend to want to change voluntarily. Let's put it that way.
One thing I would just add to that point, I know at the moment that there is, the UK government are looking very closely at all of the major national bodies in terms of how they govern diversity, different rules in terms of ownership structures. So I know that the government are looking closely at this. I know change is difficult, but ultimately they are actually taking a close look at national associations.
You can link it to funding. I mean, that's one of the key ways to actually get, if you offer more funding, if sports governing bodies actually comply with the sensible governance model. But nobody was really funding FIFA, other than, I suppose, broadcasters and sponsors. But it's when they start to lose sponsors that they do sort of wake up and take notice.
A question, I guess, for Tim, but maybe any of you. In light of the record Premier League deal, and now we've seen falling viewing figures, have people reached a point where they've said enough's enough?
Yeah, those kind of figures that came out last week were kind of took us by surprise, really, and I don't quite know what the balance is between maybe the media jumping on the bandwagon of a slight decrease. I think we always try and focus on kind of the attendance at matches, and the idea that in the current round of Premier League TV deals, there are only 2 countries where Premier League football is now not broadcast, and one of those is North Korea. So I think, yes, there is a point for the Premier League to sort of take notice and to ensure that they keep innovating and keep changing the product as much as they possibly can. But at the same time, it has been the market leader for such a long period of time now that perhaps a plateauing out effect is maybe natural.
Interestingly, though, the NFL, you may have seen some of the NFL figures too. Their viewing figures have fallen off. So there may be some comparisons there as well.
I think it's how people are consuming sports as well. Like, at the weekend now, it's rare that I'll watch Match of the Day. I'll tend to just get Sky up on my phone and watch the clips of the games over the weekend. It's just far easier and more consumable, and that's, I think, a trend across everything.
I think the one thing you will see is you won't see change quickly, anything downwards. We're in a very, very hot broadcast media rights market at the moment, and I think Champions League are going out probably first quarter next year, Premier League probably back end of 17, and don't be surprised if you suddenly start talking about £5-6 billion territory. So I think, which is unbelievable, but I think you could easily end up there.
Now, the economic value of these guys combined is immense, immense, and you've got them free at a point of consumption this evening. So, 1 or 2 final pointed questions for them before we go.
Yeah, it's funny. I can't talk about Frisbee, I have to say, although it sounds exciting. But I think it was just a couple of weeks ago we had UFC at the arena, which is the fastest growing sport in the whole of the world at the moment. And I can't quite understand it on a personal level, but it is something that is massively engaging teenagers and young people at the moment. It's my nephew bought a ticket very late, came up on the train, and it didn't even start till something ridiculous like 5 a.m, but it was absolutely packed. So I think UFC is a good example of how somebody just comes along and effectively develops something, which to me is a variation on boxing, which to me isn't the most attractive sport in the world, and yet UFC has marketed itself very cleverly in a way to be that it's something different.
eSports as well. I mean,
eSports.
that's, again, nice something I'm obviously old and struggle with as well, but to actually tune in to watch people playing computer games.
Keep in mind that one of the local clubs, Manchester City, has just recruited its first professional eSports player. So Manchester City has a console gamer on its payroll, and it's not unusual. There are several German football clubs, for example, so Werder Bremen, Bayern Munich have got professional eSports players now playing for them.
More people in the US watched the final of FIFA Online, I don't know the correct terminology, than have watched a single Premier League game at any point last season. eSports, we predict, is going to really, really take off, and with eSports will come governance issues, structure issues, exactly the same as we see across what you might term normal sports.
I think a line to that is traditional sports have had to reinvent themselves as well. If you look at the popularity of rugby sevens at the Olympics,
2020
and 2020 in cricket, I was just about to say, cricket is often criticised for being too complicated. Well, 2020 is actually very, very straightforward. It can be consumed in a reasonable amount of time. So sports do have to challenge themselves to say, well, we might have a very core market who love what we do, but actually if you want to grow and still be around in 20 years, you've got to appeal to the digital masses.
There's a current proposal for short format golf. So very kind of quick, fast rounds of golf. There's already cricket and rugby, some snooker, some short form snooker. So it is those traditional forms that are adapting as well.
I just had an observation about the growth of eSports and bringing this back to the first talk. eSports is not only consumed sitting down, it's played sitting down, isn't it? So I think we're in trouble.
What are you doing at the moment, Phil? Okay, one more killer question before we go. Cowards. Okay, first hand up at the back.
It's been a bit football centric, and I do appreciate you've got a cricket interest, and it's been great to hear from somebody in the sport. But I was just thinking about the sort of the value of thinking about the supply chain for the sports that Manchester is renowned for, and getting us back onto the Manchester focus. Are the clubs, are the professional sports, the traditional sports, doing enough to protect the supply chain of talented young people from Manchester into sport?
Well, I mean,
social science hats on there.
I would say this, wouldn't I? But as our academy intake starts tonight. So actually, and it's very difficult to get into the Lancashire Academy. So we pride ourselves on developing and encouraging young people from age group teams, from under 12s all the way up to the academy. And last year we had a 20-year-old make their debut and score a first-class century. We had a 19-year-old who scored 1,200 runs in the county championship at an average of 50, which is good, and could make their debut for England in India on Wednesday this week. So, it's very, very important to continue to develop and encourage young people to come and play sport and to and to aspire to play for England, and for us to have a 19-year-old potentially playing for England is fantastic, and it's a fantastic role model for other kids in our community to want to pick up a bat and ball and to come and play in our academy. So I can only talk about cricket. I like to think we're doing our bit.
Thanks for bringing it back to Manchester. Thank you for doing that. I think the other thing that I would, one of the ways in which I would respond is the supply chain is not just about on-field playing talent. It's also about off-field talent as well. And what always amazes me about this particular part of town is that you've got lots and lots of business startups. So even above us in this building, there are startups. So for example, the graphics for Match of the Day are produced by a company that started up specifically in Salford Quays around the BBC 3 or 4 years ago. And I guess as people who work in universities, we have a role to play in this, in fostering and encouraging entrepreneurship and innovation and different ways of thinking. And I guess that's why we're here. You know, the 3 universities are here, and we've run this evening to try and raise these issues as being important issues. So I think it's important from my perspective, certainly, is we're not all runners and jumpers, and you know, we're not all going to play cricket at 19 years old for England, but maybe we might begin a successful startup, or maybe we might publish work in a leading international journal, or maybe we might be involved in some groundbreaking research. So I think it's important to remember that as well. I'm actually going to stop it there because there's really the most important thing of the whole evening. Can you spot the public sector worker in the room? Okay. If you work in the public sector, it's compulsory. You know, even if you want to leave to go to the bathroom, you need to fill a form in and get permission from a committee somewhere. So before you leave, can I ask that, please, would you fill in your evaluation sheet? If you don't fill in your evaluation sheet, I will find you. I'll come and get you. But otherwise, show of appreciation for last.